The camera opens on a dark alley in London. Rain glistens on the cobblestones, neon lights flicker in the distance, and the faint echo of a pub door slamming shut cuts through the silence. A voice breaks in, calm, steady, but with an edge of danger. For as long as London has stood, there's been a shadow running alongside it. A world built not on law, but on loyalty, violence, and fear. This is London's hidden legacy, the story of organized crime. Not the polished fictional glamour of Hollywood, but the raw, bloody truth of a city where gangsters carved out empires with razors, fists, and iron bars. Long before today's surveillance cameras and digital footprints, men with names whispered in pubs and backstreets controlled the city. Names like the Sabinis, who ruled racecourse betting with ruthless precision. The Corteses, whose reign in Soho bled money through clubs and rackets. The Richardson brothers, who made South London their fortress. And of course, the Kray Twins, the East End legends who became icons of both terror and celebrity. But woven into this brutal tapestry of 20th century London crime, one name burns brighter and darker than most. A man whose very nickname carried the weight of madness, Mad Frankie Fraser. Born in 1923, Fraser wasn't destined for an ordinary life. From a young age, he found himself drawn not to the safety of honest work, but to the adrenaline of street life. His reputation exploded in the Underworld when he slashed Gangland boss Jack Spot, earning him both notoriety and the moniker that would follow him for the rest of his days. Mad Frankie, a name that suggested unpredictability, danger, and a willingness to go further than anyone else. By the 1960s, Fraser had become a key enforcer for one of the most feared outfits in the capital, the Richardson Gang of South London. Eddie and Charlie Richardson had built an empire on a simple but devastatingly effective model. But their empire needed teeth, men who could ensure loyalty, men who could make refusal unthinkable. That's where Frankie came in. His role was as clear as it was terrifying. Walk into a pub or club in South London, and chances are you'd find one of Eddie Richardson's one-armed bandits, fruit machines set up to churn out profits. But those machines didn't appear by chance. They were installed because Frankie and men like him protected the premises. Protection in this world was no polite offer. A landlord who cooperated found security, a steady share of profits, and the backing of the most dangerous gang in the city. But refusal? Refusal meant smashed windows, burned out businesses, or landlords themselves being introduced to Frankie's blade. Fraser himself remembered those days not as grim or oppressive, but intoxicating. After serving a 7-year prison sentence, he reconnected with the Richardsons and never looked back. I liked them immediately. That was it, he would later recall. To him, they weren't just gangsters. They were family. They were opportunity, and the lifestyle was irresistible. Frankie spoke of it with a gleam in his eye. The sleek Bentleys that turned heads on London streets, the velvet ropes pulled aside at nightclubs where champagne flowed endlessly, the kind of financial success that made the law feel irrelevant. When it was good, he said once, it was very, very good. Behind that glamour stood the two brothers who ran the machine. Eddie Richardson was the enforcer, the visible muscle who made sure debts were paid and rules obeyed. His brother Charlie was the strategist, the businessman who turned muscle into money. Together they blended brains and brawn, building Atlantic gaming machines and flooding Soho's pubs and clubs with their fruit machines. It wasn't just the profits from the machines themselves, it was the rackets around them, the protection money, the fear. And yet their associates swore the Richardsons were fair. They put you in on the coup and gave you a fair share, one said. Unlike other gangs that hoarded wealth, the Richardsons claimed not to be greedy. They created loyalty not just through fear, but by making sure everyone ate. Still, when it came to rivals, fear was the primary currency. Violence was not random. It was strategic. When Polish gangs began muscling in on their territory, trying to plant machines where Richardson influence already held sway, Frankie and his associates responded with brutal efficiency. Rivals were cornered, attacked, chopped up a bit, as Frankie casually described it, blades carving into legs as a warning that lingered longer than bruises. And what followed those assaults? Nothing. No arrests, no police dragging men into court. Because in those days, London's streets were a different world. No CCTV cameras, no mobile phones recording every move. Frankie laughed when he compared it to today. You was lucky to find a phone box that worked, he said. It was a lawless playground, and the Richardsons thrived. But while Fraser was feared on the outside, he was even more infamous on the inside. Over his lifetime, he would spend more than 70 years in prison, an astonishing stretch that spanned not only his own life, but even his son's. Frankie never bowed to authority. "I would never give in," he said defiantly, a motto that became his prison creed. And he meant it. From the moment he first stepped inside, he resisted with everything he had. When riots broke out in Parkhurst Prison, Fraser wasn't just a participant, he was the spark. That rebellion earned him another 5 years on top of his sentence, but it only strengthened his legend. He was even accused of kidnapping the governor of Wormwood Scrubs. Fraser referred to it as Onsworth, and attempting to hang him. The stories spiraled into myth. Officers whispered about the day Fraser sliced off a prison guard's ear, flushing it down the toilet as if to erase the evidence in the most grotesque way possible. The guard, now forever disfigured, carried a new nickname, Ariel Harry, a cruel joke born of brutality. Prison authorities found Fraser impossible to manage. His rebellion was relentless. Time and again, he assaulted staff, fought back against the system, and refused to be broken. The solution? They tried to have him declared insane, hoping to shift him into Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. But Fraser only saw opportunity. "It suited me," he admitted. Broadmoor was much better than prison. His philosophy was simple: fight or be crushed. "I first punched a prison officer when I was very young," he recalled, almost with pride. He wasn't a large man, small in stature compared to many, but his fury made him dangerous. "They'd make life very hard for me, and I would just retaliate." To Fraser, every act of violence was self-defense, not weakness. In his mind, the prison system was the enemy, and survival demanded constant resistance. And yet beneath the madness and the violence, there was a strange consistency. Frankie was always, in his own way, loyal to the Richardsons, to his code, even to his warped sense of fairness. He was chaos contained in a man, someone who thrived in a world of fear because he knew how to make others more afraid than he ever was. But as the 1960s rolled on, cracks were beginning to show. The Richardsons' empire had grown bold, too bold. Violence that once hid in the shadows was spilling into the open. Frankie's reputation as an untouchable enforcer was colliding with a system that could no longer ignore him. London was changing, and the very forces that had once made the Richardsons invincible were now turning against them. The story of Frankie Fraser and the Richardsons was reaching a boiling point. The glamour of the Bentleys and nightclubs would soon be overshadowed by trials, betrayals, and brutal reckonings. For Mad Frankie, the taste of power was sweet, but the cost of loyalty was about to become unbearable. The East End of London, narrow streets, cramped flats, and smoke-filled pubs where whispers traveled faster than the police. Here, across the river from South London's Richardson Empire, another dynasty rose to power. They were called simply the Firm. Their leaders were a trio of brothers, fronted by the imposing presence of Charlie Kray and defined by the identical twins who would etch their names into British criminal folklore, Ronnie and Reggie. To the public, they were almost mythic, two mirror images in sharp suits, moving like shadows through Soho's clubs and the East End's back streets. To their loyal followers, they were protectors and providers. But behind the glamour, behind the aura of invincibility, lay a much darker truth. Ronnie Kray was the fire that burned brightest and most dangerously. His mind was a battlefield. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, his world was filled with delusions of grandeur and flashes of terrifying violence. He dreamed not only of ruling the East End, but of extending his empire to every major city across the United Kingdom. To him, the Firm wasn't just a gang, it was destiny. He carried himself as if the crown of the Underworld had already been placed on his head. But his condition made him unpredictable. Conversations could turn in an instant. Loyalty was rewarded lavishly, but perceived disloyalty could mean sudden, brutal punishment. And yet the Krays insisted on their own twisted code of conduct. Women and children were, in their words, untouchable. Ordinary working people, the very backbone of East London, were not to be harassed or exploited. They styled themselves as Robin Hood figures, sparing the innocent while reserving their fury for rivals, traitors, and those who dared step into their territory. As Reggie once remarked, any ruse we had was only amongst ourselves. It was a principle that, paradoxically, won them a strange respect from locals. Fear was ever present, but so too was admiration. The butcher, the dock worker, the shopkeeper. They could sleep at night knowing the Krays weren't coming for them. But beyond the East End, not everyone was impressed. To associates of the Richardson Gang, the Krays were little more than pretenders. One associate recalled dismissing them with a sneer, branding them two puffs, a cruel slur aimed at their perceived weakness, particularly at Ronnie's open homosexuality in an era when such revelations carried heavy stigma. In their eyes, the Krays weren't hardened criminals, but boys who had stepped out of fantasy magazines, trying to play roles they didn't understand. Both of them. No brains, the associate spat. Where the Richardsons approached crime as a business, profit-driven, organized, pragmatic, the Krays seemed intoxicated by the performance of gangsterism itself. Reggie, quieter and more calculating than his twin, was often described as the brains of the two. But even he, critics claimed, lacked the vision that made men like Charlie Richardson so dangerous. The Krays loved the spotlight, the front-page photos, the whispers of their names across Soho. They weren't just running rackets. They were feeding their own mythology. And in that mythology, the line between reality and fantasy blurred dangerously. The rivalry between these worlds, the cold efficiency of the Richardsons and the theatrical swagger of the Krays, became a defining clash of London's underworld. Those who knew both sides drew a sharp contrast. One Richardson man scoffed, "If they put me and my brother in a cell with them two, there's only two people coming out. That's me and my brother." It wasn't bravado. It was a declaration of the difference between hard, street-bred toughness and what they saw as the Krays' obsession with image. The tension between these factions underscored a larger truth about organized crime in London during the 1960s. For every glass of champagne poured in a Mayfair nightclub, there was a beating in a back alley. For every polished Bentley idling outside a Soho venue, there was a man lying broken in the gutter. Glamour and brutality existed side by side, inseparable, each feeding the other. The flash drew attention, the violence maintained control. The Richardsons built their empire on numbers, machines, and profit margins. They spoke of running the business like merchants who happened to use razors instead of contracts. The Krays, by contrast, were actors in their own drama. They courted journalists, posed for photographs, and let their legend grow in the tabloids. They weren't just criminals. They were celebrities, notorious at a time when notoriety itself had value. But image is a fragile foundation. While the Richardsons worried about cash flow, the Krays worried about perception. One was rooted in pragmatism, the other in fantasy. And all of this unfolded in an era uniquely suited to their rise. London in the 1960s was still a city of shadows. Surveillance cameras were unheard of. Wiretaps were primitive, inconsistent. Police corruption was rampant and evidence often disappeared before it could ever reach a courtroom. Criminals could act with near impunity, their only true risks coming from rival gangs or betrayal within their own ranks. As one gangster dryly recalled, "You was lucky to find a phone box that worked." In such a world, violence was not only common, it was a language. A way to negotiate, to intimidate, to declare ownership of a street or a pub or an entire neighborhood. But no empire lasts forever. The same fear that kept rivals in check began to bleed into the lives of associates and allies. Violence once contained spilled out recklessly. The glamour of the nightclubs began to look tawdry against the blood that stained the streets. Frankie Fraser, the Richardsons, the Krays, all of them had built their reputations on the twin pillars of loyalty and fear. But loyalty is fragile, and fear has limits. When the law finally came knocking with more determination than ever before, those empires began to crumble. Yet the legacy endured. Decades later, figures like Fraser would be remembered less for the money they made and more for the myths they created. Prison exploits, riots, violent outbursts, they became stories told and retold, each time more exaggerated, more legendary. The Krays became cultural icons, immortalized in films and biographies. The Richardsons remained infamous, their names evoking a different kind of respect. Together, they embodied a time when the underworld ruled unchecked, when men could carve out kingdoms in the heart of London with nothing more than blades, fists, and the will to dominate. This was more than crime. It was culture. It was myth-making. It was the creation of modern gangster folklore, a uniquely British brand of legend that blurred the line between horror and fascination. To some, these men were villains. To others, they were working-class heroes who stood against the establishment. But to everyone, they were unforgettable. And in the end, Perhaps that's what they wanted all along. Power fades, empires collapse, money vanishes. But the story remains. The camera lingers on a grainy black and white photo. The Kray twins, suited, unsmiling, their eyes daring you to look away. Then a flash, Frankie Fraser in handcuffs, smirking as guards pull him toward another cell door. These images, frozen in time, remind us that history is not only written in ink, but in fear, in scars, and in silence. London has changed. Cameras are everywhere now. Organized crime is more discreet, hidden behind digital screens instead of smoky pubs. But the ghosts of that era still haunt the city. The laughter from Soho's clubs, the screams from South London basements, the echo of fists against prison walls, they linger, refusing to fade. And as we look back, we're left with one final question. Were these men simply products of their time, or did they shape the very city itself? Perhaps both. What is certain is that their shadows stretch long, reaching into the present, reminding us that behind every glamorous story lies a brutal truth. Because in London's underworld, legends are born not just from what men built, but from what they destroyed. If you've been captivated by this story of London's most infamous gangs, dive deeper into the hidden world of organized crime by subscribing. More untold histories, more shadows brought into the light, because the story doesn't end here.